I never thought I'd taken a lodger. It was an impulsive decision, one born out of desperation. After my divorce, I found myself struggling to keep up with the bills for the old Victorian house I once shared with my wife. The idea of renting out the spare room seemed practical, if not ideal. I just didn't expect him. The man who showed up on my doorstep one rainy evening introduced himself as Andrew. He was polite, almost excessively so, with a soft voice that made him seem harmless. His face was unremarkable, his clothes plain, and his demeanor quiet. Too quiet, maybe, but I convinced myself that was a good thing. I wasn't looking for a friend, just someone to help with the mortgage. Andrew moved in that same night, carrying only a small duffel bag. When I offered to help, he declined with a quick shake of his head and disappeared into the spare room. He spent most of his time there, rarely coming out except for the occasional trip to the kitchen. I barely heard him speak after that first evening. The house was eerily silent, save for the creaks and groans of its old bones. The first week passed without incident, though I couldn't shake a peculiar feeling about Andrew. He had a habit of closing doors softly, almost deliberately. His footsteps were light, nearly imperceptible. More than once, I caught myself wondering if he was even there at all. I'd knock on his door to check in, but his responses were always the same. "I'm fine, thank you." It wasn't until the second week that things started to change. Small, subtle things at first. A glass I hadn't used appeared in the sink. My wallet, which I was certain I'd left on the kitchen counter, turned up on the coffee table. And then there was the humming. Late at night, when the world outside was dead quiet, I'd hear it. A low, almost melodic hum emanating from Andrew's room. It was faint, just enough to prick the edges of my awareness. I told myself it was nothing, just him watching TV or listening to music. But when I leaned close to his door one night, I realized the sound wasn't coming from any device. It was him. By the third week, I began to notice the smell. It was faint at first, like mildew or damp wood. I scrubbed the floors, washed the walls, even called a plumber to check for leaks, but the smell persisted. It seemed strongest near Andrew's door. When I asked him about it, he smiled faintly and said, "I haven't noticed anything." That smile stuck with me, not because it was friendly, but because it felt wrong. It didn't reach his eyes, which remained dull and lifeless. I started avoiding him after that, and he seemed content to keep to himself. Still, the smell grew worse, and so did the humming. One night, unable to sleep, I wandered into the kitchen for a glass of water. The house was pitch dark, save for the faint glow of moonlight streaming through the windows. As I reached for the faucet, I froze. Andrew was standing in the corner of the room, staring out the window. He didn't move or acknowledge me. For a moment, I thought he might be sleepwalking, but then he spoke. "It's almost time," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "Time for what?" I asked, my throat dry. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked back to his room, his footsteps so light they made no sound on the wooden floor. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, gripping the edge of the counter, trying to steady my breathing. The next morning, Andrew was gone. His door was ajar, and the room was empty. The bed was neatly made, the duffel bag gone. Relief washed over me as I realized he'd left without a word. But as I stepped inside the room, my relief turned to unease. The smell was overpowering, like rotting meat mixed with damp earth. On the walls were faint, spidery marked symbols I didn't recognize, drawn in what looked like black ink. I scrubbed the walls until my arms ached, but the marks wouldn't come off. I considered calling the police, but what would I say? That my lodger left some weird drawings on the walls. Instead, I decided to move on. Andrew was gone, and that was all that mattered. 2 nights later, I woke to the sound of humming. It was louder this time, resonating through the house like a low, mournful chant. My heart pounded as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound was coming from the spare room, but Andrew was gone. I'd seen him leave, hadn't I? Clutching a flashlight, I crept down the hallway. The door to the spare room was closed, though I was certain I'd left it open. The smell hit me before I even touched the handle, that same putrid stench, stronger than ever. My hand trembled as I pushed the door open. The room was empty. The walls were bare, the bed untouched, but the humming persisted, louder now, almost deafening. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. And then I saw it, a faint human-shaped shadow etched into the corner of the ceiling, pulsating with every note of the haunting tune. I stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. The humming stopped instantly, leaving the house in oppressive silence. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked in the driveway, too afraid to go back inside. The next morning, I called a friend to stay with me. I didn't tell him everything, just that the house was creeping me out. He laughed it off, but agreed to spend the night. That evening, we watched movies, drank beer, and pretended nothing was wrong. For a while, I almost believed it. Until the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and the humming began again. My friend's laughter died on his lips as the sound filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "It's him," I said, my voice barely audible. "He's still here." We grabbed flashlights and crept toward the spare room. The door was open this time, swinging gently on its hinges. The smell was overwhelming, making us gag. My friend pointed his flashlight inside, and we both froze. The walls were covered in black symbols, pulsating as if alive. In the center of the room stood Andrew, his face twisted into a grotesque grin. His eyes were pitch black, and his skin seemed to ripple like water. "It's time," he said, his voice a distorted echo. The symbols on the walls began to glow, and the room seemed to fold in on itself. My friend screamed and bolted down the hallway, but I couldn't move. Andrew's grin widened as he reached out toward me, his hand impossibly long and thin. In a surge of adrenaline, I slammed the door shut and shoved a chair under the handle. The humming grew louder, shaking the walls, but I didn't stop running until I was outside. My friend was already in his car, yelling for me to get in. We drove away without looking back. The next day, I called the police and told them I'd had a break-in. When they arrived, the spare room was empty. The symbols were gone. The smell dissipated. The only sign of Andrew's presence was a single black mark on the ceiling, faint and barely noticeable. I sold the house a month later, moved to a cramped apartment in the city, far from the quiet isolation of that cursed Victorian. But some nights when the world is silent and still, I hear it, that low, melodic hum, echoing in the corners of my mind. I tell myself it's just my imagination. But deep down, I know better. The highway stretched endlessly before me, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the black abyss of the night. I'd been driving for hours, the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the tires on the road my only companions. The road trip was supposed to clear my head after the breakup, but now it just felt like running away. My phone had died hours ago, leaving me with nothing but static on the radio and my own uneasy thoughts. When the rest stop sign appeared, glowing faintly in the distance, I felt a surge of relief. I hadn't seen another car in miles, and the coffee I'd downed earlier was working against me. The idea of stretching my legs and using the restroom was too good to pass up. The sign promised facilities and vending machines, the bare minimum of civilization in the middle of nowhere. The parking lot was eerily empty, lit by a handful of dim, flickering lights. I pulled into a spot near the building and killed the engine. For a moment, I sat in the car, the silence pressing in on me. The rest stop looked old, its paint peeling and windows streaked with grime. But it was open, and that was all that mattered. The air outside was cold, biting through my jacket as I hurried toward the entrance. The automatic door slid open with a groan, and I stepped into a harshly lit hallway. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, casting long shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of my eye. The vending machines stood at the far end of the hall, their ancient offerings barely visible behind cracked glass. The restroom door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the empty space. Inside, the air was damp and smelled faintly of mildew. 2 of the 3 stalls were closed, their locks rusted. I chose the open one and tried not to think about the graffiti scrawled across the walls. As I finished and stepped out to wash my hands, I heard it, a faint, muffled sobbing. I froze, the sound sending a chill down my spine. It was coming from one of the closed stalls. I hadn't noticed anyone else come in. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. The sobbing stopped abruptly, replaced by a heavy silence. I stared at the closed stall doors, my pulse pounding in my ears. The rational part of me said it was probably just someone having a bad night, but something about the stillness felt wrong, unnatural. I stepped closer, hesitating in front of the first stall. My hand hovered over the door. "Are you okay?" No response. Summoning my courage, I pushed the door open. The stall was empty, just a grimy toilet and peeling paint. The sobbing started again, louder this time, coming from the next stall over. My stomach turned. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice rising. The sobbing turned to laughter. Low, guttural, and wrong, it reverberated through the restroom, coming from everywhere at once. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The lights flickered violently, plunging the room into brief moments of darkness. When the lights stabilized, the restroom was silent. The stalls were all open now, their doors swinging gently as if moved by an unseen breeze. I backed away, heart hammering, and bolted for the exit. The hallway was darker than before. The buzzing lights dimmed to a sickly yellow. The vending machines flickered erratically, their displays cycling through nonsensical characters. I hurried toward the exit, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. But as I reached the doors, they didn't open. I waved my hand in front of the sensor. Nothing. I pushed against the glass, but it didn't budge. Panic surged through me as I pounded on the door. "Hello? Is anyone out there?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the oppressive silence. I turned, scanning the hallway for another way out, and froze. At the far end of the corridor, near the vending machines, stood a figure. It was a woman, her back to me. She wore a faded dress, its hem frayed and stained. Her hair hung in damp, tangled strands, and she stood unnaturally still, as if she were a mannequin. I opened my mouth to call out, but the words died in my throat. Something about her presence felt wrong. Slowly, she turned her head, just enough for me to see the edge of her face. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark pits. She smiled, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and began to hum, the same haunting melody I'd heard in the restroom. I stumbled back, my legs threatening to give out. The hallway stretched impossibly long, the walls closing in as her humming grew louder. She took a step toward me, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on tangled strings. I turned and ran. The hallway seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. Doors appeared and vanished as I ran, each one locked or leading to another identical corridor. The woman's humming followed me, growing louder, closer. My breath came in ragged gasps, my vision blurring with panic. Finally, I burst into a large room I hadn't seen before. It was dimly lit, with cracked tile floors and walls lined with dusty mirrors. At the center stood a single vending machine, its contents obscured by frost. My reflection in the mirrors looked warped, distorted, and behind me, in every reflection, stood the woman. Her jagged smile widened as she stepped closer, her image multiplying in the mirrors. I spun around, but the room was empty. The humming was deafening now, vibrating through my skull. "What do you want from me?" I screamed, my voice cracking. The mirrors shattered all at once, shards flying through the air. I ducked, shielding my face, and when I looked up, the woman was gone. The room was silent, the vending machine dark. A single door stood ajar on the far wall, light spilling through the crack. I didn't hesitate. I ran through the door, emerging into the cold night air. My car was still there, the parking lot just as empty as before. I didn't look back as I jumped into the driver's seat, fumbled with the keys, and started the engine. The tires screeched as I tore out of the lot. The rest stopped disappearing in my rearview mirror. I drove for hours, refusing to stop until the sun began to rise. When I finally pulled over at a diner, my hands were still shaking. The waitress gave me a concerned look as she poured my coffee, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. What could I say? That a ghostly woman trapped me in a labyrinthine rest stop. Weeks later, I tried to find the rest stop again. I'd convinced myself it was just a nightmare, a trick of my sleep-deprived mind. But when I reached that stretch of highway, the rest stop wasn't there. Just an overgrown patch of land, its cracked pavement barely visible beneath the weeds. Sometimes when I'm driving alone at night, I think I hear it, that low, haunting hum carried on the wind, and I wonder if the woman is still waiting, her jagged smile hidden in the shadows of another lonely rest stop. I've been driving for a rideshare company for a little over a year now. Most nights are uneventful, ferrying drunken college kids, late shift workers, and the occasional quiet loner just trying to get home. But one night changed everything, leaving me with a story I'll never forget or fully understand. It was a slow Tuesday evening, the kind where the city feels dead, and I'd been debating calling it quits when the ride request came through. The pickup was from a remote area on the edge of town where the streetlights barely worked, and the roads were lined with overgrown trees. Something about the location gave me pause. But a ride's a ride, so I accepted. The GPS led me to a desolate stretch of road. There was no house, no visible landmarks, just a rusted old bench under a flickering streetlight. My headlights swept across the area as I slowed, and that's when I saw her. She was standing by the bench, dressed in a long, dark coat that seemed too heavy for the mild weather. Her face was obscured by the shadows, but her posture was rigid, almost unnatural. I rolled down the window and called out, "Are you waiting for a ride?" She nodded and stepped closer. When the light hit her face, I felt a shiver run down my spine. She was pale, almost ghostly, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. But she didn't seem threatening, just off. "Hop in," I said, trying to mask my unease. She slid into the backseat without a word. The ride started in silence, the only sounds the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of static from the radio. I checked the rearview mirror. She was sitting perfectly still, staring straight ahead, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "So, where are you headed?" I asked, hoping to break the tension. She didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Just keep driving." Okay," I said, glancing at the GPS. The destination she'd entered was a cemetery on the outskirts of town. My grip tightened on the wheel. "You visiting someone?" She didn't answer. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her face just visible in the rearview mirror. "Do you believe in ghosts?" she asked, her tone calm but unnerving. I let out a nervous laugh. "I've heard some stories, but I've never seen anything myself." "Why?" She didn't reply, sinking back into silence. My unease grew with every passing mile. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the trees on either side closing in like a tunnel. The further we went, the more the air in the car felt heavy, suffocating. About halfway to the destination, the radio crackled again, but this time it wasn't static. A voice, distorted and faint, emerged from the noise, speaking words I couldn't understand. I reached to turn it off, but the knob didn't respond. The voice grew louder, the words sharper, though still unintelligible. "Do you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. She was staring out the window now, her reflection in the glass distorted and wrong. I felt a chill creep up my spine as I realized her lips were moving, though no sound came out. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the road, but the streetlights began to flicker, and the darkness between them seemed to deepen, pressing against the car like a living thing. My headlights barely pierced the gloom, and the trees outside seemed to twist and warp as we passed. When we finally reached the cemetery, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The GPS announced, "You have arrived at your destination," but the woman didn't move. She sat there, staring at the gates with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "Here we are," I said, forcing a smile. Do you need me to wait for you?" She turned to face me, her eyes darker than I'd thought possible. "Thank you for the ride," she said softly. Then she opened the door and stepped out. I watched her walk toward the gates, her figure fading into the shadows. A part of me wanted to drive away immediately, but something kept me rooted in place. I rolled down the window, leaning out to get a better look. That's when I saw her stop and turn. For the first time, she smiled. It wasn't a kind smile, it was sharp, chilling, and filled with something I can only describe as malice. She raised a hand, waving slowly, and then she disappeared into the darkness. I sat there for what felt like hours, my heart racing and my mind spinning. Finally, I snapped out of it and drove away, refusing to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to know if she was still there, watching. When I got home, I checked the app to review the ride details, but the trip wasn't in my history. It was as if it had never happened. My car still smelled faintly of a cold, damp scent that lingered for days no matter how much I cleaned. I've told a few people about that night, but no one believes me. They think it's a story I made up to spook passengers or amuse myself on slow nights, but I know what I saw. And sometimes when I'm driving alone on those dark, empty roads, I catch a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror, a shadow, a flicker of movement, and I wonder if she's still out there, waiting for her next ride. Moving into an old Victorian house had always been a dream of mine. I loved the creaky floors, the ornate woodwork, and the sense of history that came with every corner. So when I found an affordable rental in one such house, I jumped at the chance. The landlord mentioned that it had been sitting empty for a while, but I didn't mind. The place had character, and I couldn't wait to make it my own. What the landlord failed to mention was the attic. The first few days were uneventful. I busied myself unpacking, decorating, and settling into the rhythm of the quiet neighborhood. But by the end of the week, I began to notice it, faint whispers, almost inaudible, drifting down from the attic at night. At first, I convinced myself it was nothing. The house was old, and old houses made noises. Maybe it was the wind or the settling of the beams. But as the nights went on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They weren't words I could understand, but there was a cadence to them, like a conversation just out of earshot. On the fifth night, curiosity got the better of me. Armed with a flashlight, I decided to investigate. The attic door was a pull-down hatch in the hallway ceiling, with a rickety ladder that creaked under my weight. The air grew colder as I climbed, and the faint smell of dust and mildew filled my nostrils. The attic was vast, its slanted ceiling casting long shadows in the beam of my flashlight. Old trunks, broken furniture, and forgotten relics littered the space, draped in cobwebs. I scanned the room, my heart pounding in my chest, but I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to leave, the whispers started again. This time they were unmistakable, surrounding me from all sides. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The beam landed on a dusty old mirror propped against the far wall. For a moment, I thought I saw movement within its cracked surface, a shadow that wasn't mine. I bolted back down the ladder, slamming the attic door shut and locking it for good measure. Sleep didn't come easy that night. The whispers continued, muffled but persistent, as if they were angry that I'd intruded. The next morning, I called the landlord. I tried to sound casual as I asked if there was anything I should know about the attic. He hesitated before responding. "I don't go up there," he admitted. "The previous tenants complained about noises, but it's probably just squirrels or something. Old houses have their quirks, you know." His explanation didn't comfort me. Whatever was in the attic, it wasn't squirrels. Over the next few days, the whispers grew bolder, spilling into the rest of the house. They followed me from room to room, faint and mocking. Objects began to move on their own. A chair pushed slightly out from the table, a picture frame tilted on the wall, doors creaking open despite being locked. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps above me. They were slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth across the attic floor. I stayed frozen in bed, clutching the covers, my mind racing. The footsteps stopped directly above my bed, and for a moment the house fell deathly silent. Then came the knock. 3 sharp raps, as if someone were knocking from inside the attic, right above my head. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, I lay there, paralyzed, until the first light of dawn broke through the curtains. I couldn't stay in the house any longer, but I didn't want to leave without answers. Desperation led me to research the property's history. What I found chilled me to the bone. The house had once belonged to a family in the early 1900s. The youngest daughter, Clara, had been confined to the attic after displaying odd behaviors. According to old newspaper clippings, she spoke of voices and shadows that no one else could see. The family claimed she had gone mad, but one article suggested a darker truth. Clara had vanished one night, and her disappearance was never solved. Some believed she had run away. Others whispered of foul play. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to confront whatever was in the attic. I don't know what I hoped to achieve, closure, perhaps, or proof that I wasn't losing my mind. With trembling hands, I climbed the ladder once more, flashlight in one hand and a rosary in the other. The attic felt colder than before, and the whispers started as soon as I stepped inside. They were louder now, overlapping and frantic, as if warning me to leave. I approached the mirror, its cracked surface reflecting the beam of my flashlight. "Clara," I whispered, my voice shaking. "If you're here, I just want to help." The whispers stopped. For a moment, the attic was silent, and I felt a flicker of hope. But then the mirror began to fog over, as if someone were breathing on the other side. Words appeared, scrawled in the condensation by an invisible hand. "Help me." I stumbled back, tripping over an old trunk. The air grew heavy, oppressive, and the whispers returned, louder and more frantic than ever. Shadows danced across the walls, converging toward the mirror. In the chaos, I saw her, a pale, gaunt figure trapped within the glass, her hollow eyes pleading with me. "I'm sorry," I screamed, scrambling back down the ladder. I slammed the attic door shut and ran out of the house, not stopping until I was safely in my car. I moved out the next day, leaving most of my belongings behind. The landlord seemed unfazed when I told him I couldn't stay, as if he'd heard it all before. I didn't care about getting my deposit back. I just wanted to be as far away from that house as possible. I've tried to move on, but the memories haunt me. Sometimes, late at night, I hear faint whispers, as if carried in the wind, and when I catch my reflection in the mirror, I can't help but wonder if Clara is still trapped, waiting for someone brave enough to set her free. They say dogs are man's best friend, but I've never believed that since my encounter with the Black Hound. It started late one evening, after I'd been driving for hours along a lonely stretch of highway. The GPS told me to take a detour some back roads that would supposedly save me 20 minutes. The shortcut was desolate, flanked by dense woods on either side, and the dim glow of my headlights barely cut through the darkness. As I rounded a curve, a figure darted into the road. Slamming on the brakes, I skidded to a stop, my heart pounding. The figure turned to face me, a massive black dog with glowing yellow eyes. Its fur was matted, and its gaze locked onto mine with a chilling intensity. I should have been relieved when it sauntered off into the woods, but I wasn't. Something about that dog didn't feel right. I pressed on, shaking off the encounter as my imagination running wild. But 20 minutes later, the dog appeared again. This time it stood at the edge of the woods, watching as I drove past. I kept my eyes on the road, trying to ignore the uneasy feeling crawling up my spine. Then it happened again. And again, no matter how far I drove, the Black Hound was always there, lurking just at the edge of my vision. By the time I reached my destination, a remote rental cabin, the encounter was all I could think about. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by woods, with no neighbors for miles. Normally, I would have appreciated the solitude, but that night it felt oppressive. I locked the doors and windows, double-checking them before settling into the creaky old armchair by the fireplace. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was unnerving, and every creak of the cabin seemed amplified in the silence. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because I woke to a soft thudding sound. At first, I thought it was the wind knocking a branch against the window, but when I looked over, my blood ran cold. The Black Hound was outside, its glowing yellow eyes fixed on me through the glass. I tried to convince myself it was just a stray dog, but deep down I knew better. Its gaze was too intelligent, too deliberate. It didn't bark or growl. It simply stared, unblinking. Grabbing a flashlight and a kitchen knife, I decided to confront it. Maybe if I scared it off, it would leave me alone. But when I opened the door, the hound was gone. The only evidence of its presence was a set of massive paw prints leading into the woods. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The woods were eerily silent, the usual nighttime chorus of crickets and owls conspicuously absent. The beam of my flashlight flickered, casting long, distorted shadows among the trees. The paw prints led deeper into the forest, eventually stopping in a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood a weathered stone altar, covered in strange carvings. The paw prints ended abruptly at its base, as if the hound had vanished into thin air. A low growl echoed from the darkness, and I spun around, flashlight trembling in my hand. The Black Hound emerged from the shadows, its eyes burning brighter than before. This close, I could see its teeth long, sharp, and impossibly white. It didn't attack. Instead, it circled me slowly, its growl rumbling like distant thunder. I felt like prey, cornered and helpless. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The hound stopped and tilted its head, almost as if it understood me. Then, it let out a bone-chilling howl that seemed to shake the very ground beneath my feet. I bolted back to the cabin, slamming the door shut and barricading it with furniture. My heart raced as I listened for any signs of the hound outside. But the night remained silent, the oppressive stillness broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. When dawn finally broke, I packed my things and left. I didn't care about losing the deposit. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. But the Black Hound wasn't done with me. The sightings continued, no matter where I went. It appeared in my rearview mirror on the highway, standing at the edge of the woods near my new apartment, even in the city, where no stray dog should have been able to follow. I started researching the legend of the Black Hound, hoping to find some way to rid myself of its presence. I learned about spectral hounds and folklore omens of death, guardians of cursed places, or harbingers of the supernatural, but none of the stories offered a solution. Desperation led me back to the clearing in the woods. I returned to the stone altar, armed with candles, salt, and every protective charm I could find. As night fell, I set up a circle of protection and waited. The hound appeared just as the moon reached its zenith. It stood at the edge of the clearing, its yellow eyes glowing like twin flames. I held my ground, clutching the rosary around my neck. "Why are you following me?" I demanded. The hound's growl deepened, and it stepped forward. For a moment I thought it would attack, but instead, it stopped at the edge of the circle, its gaze piercing into mine. Then, it spoke. The voice wasn't human. It was guttural, otherworldly, and filled with an ancient malice. "You trespassed," it rumbled. "You awoke me." "I didn't mean to," I stammered. "I didn't know." The hound's eyes narrowed. "Ignorance does not absolve you." It stepped closer, the barrier of salt sizzling as it pressed against it. The air grew heavy, and I felt a pressure building in my chest, like I was being crushed from the inside. "What do you want from me?" I choked out. The hound tilted its head as if considering. Then it growled one word. "Atonement." Before I could respond, the hound let out another howl and vanished into the darkness, leaving me alone in the clearing. The oppressive weight lifted, but I knew the encounter wasn't over. To this day, I don't know what the hound meant by atonement. It hasn't appeared again, but I can feel its presence, lingering just out of sight. Every shadow, every flicker of movement in the corner of my eye reminds me that it's still watching, waiting. And I can't shake the feeling that one day it will return to collect. The static came first. It was a quiet Saturday night, and I was alone in the small, dimly lit newsroom. The local TV station, where I worked, prided itself on being always on, even if the graveyard shift meant broadcasting to a handful of insomniacs. As the evening anchor, it was my job to keep the news rolling, weather updates, human interest stories, and the occasional breaking news piece. But that night, the airwaves were filled with static. At first, I thought it was just a technical issue. Old equipment had a way of acting up, and our station wasn't exactly cutting edge. I called the technician on duty, but before I could explain, the static shifted. A faint, warbling voice emerged from the noise. "Lost, watching, please help." I froze, the phone slipping from my hand. The voice was faint, distorted, but unmistakably human. It repeated the same fragmented phrases over and over, growing louder with each cycle. My pulse quickened as I grabbed the phone again, but the line was dead. The lights in the studio flickered. Trying to shake off the unease, I focused on troubleshooting. I fiddled with the controls, checked the feed, and rebooted the system, but the voice persisted, weaving through the static like a haunting melody. "They're watching, don't look." Each time it seemed closer, more urgent. I thought about calling my boss or the police, but something held me back. Curiosity, maybe, or fear of sounding insane. Instead, I leaned closer to the monitor, straining to make sense of the garbled message. The static abruptly cleared. On the screen, a grainy black and white image flickered to life. It showed an empty room, concrete walls, a single chair, and a dim, swinging light bulb. A man sat in the chair, his face obscured by shadows. His hands were bound, and his head was slumped forward. For a moment, the room was silent. Then the man jerked upright, as if yanked by invisible strings. His face snapped toward the camera, his eyes wide and unblinking. "Help me," he whispered. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The image vanished, replaced by the station's default weather graphic. My hands shook as I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Was it a prank? A hacker? I barely had time to process when the static returned. This time, the voice was clearer. "Stay awake. Don't let them in." The lights flickered again, and the temperature in the studio seemed to drop. I felt a prickling at the back of my neck, like I was being watched. Glancing around, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just the empty newsroom, the glow of monitors, and the faint hum of equipment. Then the main monitor switched on by itself. The grainy image returned, but now the man was standing. He faced the camera, his expression blank and unnervingly still. Behind him, the shadows in the room seemed to shift, coalescing into shapes that weren't quite human. "They're coming," the man said, his voice low and guttural. "Turn it off." Panic set in. I grabbed the remote and tried to shut down the monitor, but the buttons didn't respond. I pulled the plug, but the screen stayed on, the man's hollow eyes staring back at me. Desperation turned to dread as the shadows behind him grew, their forms writhing like smoke. The lights in the newsroom flickered wildly, and the static rose to a deafening roar. I covered my ears, backing away as the man on the screen stepped closer to the camera. "Turn it off," he screamed. And then everything went dark. When the lights came back, the monitor was off, and the newsroom was eerily silent. I stood there trembling, unsure if I'd imagined the whole thing. My eyes darted to the clock. Midnight. The end of my shift. I grabbed my bag and practically ran to my car, the events of the night replaying in my mind. By the time I got home, I was convinced it had been a prank, a cruel, elaborate hoax. I tried to sleep, but the man's hollow eyes haunted me. The next day, I arrived at the station to find it buzzing with activity. My co-workers were huddled around the monitors, their faces pale. "What's going on?" I asked. One of them pointed to the screen. The broadcast from last night was looping on every channel. The grainy image of the man in the chair filled the screen. This time the message was different. He looked directly into the camera, his voice trembling. "You let them in," he said. Behind him, the shadows solidified into grotesque forms. They towered over him, their elongated limbs and featureless faces a nightmare made flesh. The man screamed as the creatures closed in, and the screen went black. The newsroom was silent. Then the lights flickered, and the monitors went to static. Over the next few days, the broadcast became a phenomenon. People across the country reported seeing the same grainy footage at random times, interrupting regular programming. Some dismissed it as a publicity stunt. Others speculated about government experiments or supernatural interference. But for me, it was personal. Every night the broadcast would find me, no matter where I was. The man's pleas grew more desperate, his warnings more cryptic. "They're here," he said one night, his eyes bloodshot. "Don't look away." I tried to escape it. I quit my job, smashed my TV, and moved to a new city. But the broadcast followed. It appeared on my phone, my computer, even reflected in windows. The shadows from the footage began seeping into my world, lurking at the edges of my vision. I started seeing them in mirrors, in dark corners, in the spaces between streetlights. The figures were always watching, waiting. I barely slept, afraid of what might happen if I closed my eyes. Then, one night, the man's voice came through clear as day. "They're inside," he whispered. The shadows came for me that night. They poured out of the walls, their inky forms writhing and twisting. I ran, but there was nowhere to hide. They cornered me, their featureless faces inches from mine. I felt their cold presence pressing in, suffocating me. And then, light. The first rays of dawn broke through the window, and the shadows recoiled, dissolving into nothing. I collapsed to the floor, gasping for air, the man's final words echoing in my mind. "Stay in the light." Now I live in constant fear. The shadows are still out there, waiting for the darkness to return. I keep every light in my house on, every candle burning, but I know it's only a matter of time. The final broadcast wasn't just a warning. It was a countdown. I'd been living in the apartment for 2 months when the light in the hallway started flickering. At first, I didn't think much of it. Old buildings have quirks, and this one was no exception. The plumbing groaned, the walls creaked, and the elevator, when it worked, sounded like it was seconds away from plummeting to the basement. The hallway light was just another inconvenience, but it didn't stay that way. The first time I noticed the flickering, I was coming home from work. It was late, the kind of late where the city feels empty and the streets hum with silence. As I stepped off the elevator, the light above my apartment door buzzed and blinked, casting strange, stuttering shadows. I paused, my keys in hand, staring at the way the shadows moved, too fluid, too deliberate. Shaking off the unease, I unlocked my door and stepped inside. I barely noticed the hum of the light as I bolted the lock behind me. Over the next week, the flickering grew worse. It wasn't just the light outside my apartment anymore. The entire hallway seemed to pulse with erratic flashes. The buzzing sound became a constant backdrop, like a swarm of unseen insects. The landlord promised to fix it, but days turned into weeks, and nothing changed. One night, as I lay in bed, I thought I saw the light through the gap beneath my door. It was odd because my hallway had no windows. The flickering spilled into my apartment, casting faint, shifting patterns on the walls. I told myself it was just my tired mind playing tricks, but sleep didn't come easily that night. The turning point came on a Saturday evening. I was home, curled up on the couch with a blanket and a cheap bottle of wine, trying to lose myself in a movie. The buzzing from the hallway had grown louder, a constant, grating presence that made it impossible to focus. Frustrated, I marched to the door and threw it open. The hallway was empty, bathed in that sickly, flickering light. But as I stood there, a shape moved at the far end, a dark, human-shaped shadow that didn't seem to belong to anyone. It hovered for a moment before slipping out of sight, swallowed by the flickering darkness. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. No response. Just the buzz of the light, louder now, almost deafening. I stepped back inside, slamming the door and locking it. My heart raced as I leaned against the door, straining to hear anything beyond the hum of the light. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind through the drafty windows, felt like a prelude to something worse. When dawn finally broke, I convinced myself it was time to leave. Maybe not permanently, but at least for a few days. I just needed to clear my head. But when I tried to leave, the elevator was out of service. The stairwell, which always smelled faintly of mildew, seemed darker than usual. The overhead lights weren't just dim, they were completely out, leaving the narrow staircase bathed in shadows. As I descended, my footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the space was larger than it should have been. Halfway down, the buzzing started again. It was faint at first, just a low vibration at the edge of hearing. But with each step, it grew louder, more insistent. By the time I reached the landing, it was deafening, and the flickering light had returned, though there were no visible bulbs. Shadows danced across the walls, their movements erratic and unnatural. I froze, unable to take another step. A shape emerged from the shadows, tall and angular, its limbs unnaturally long. It moved with a stuttering gait, as if it were caught in the same flickering rhythm as the light. My breath caught in my throat as its head tilted toward me, a featureless void where its face should have been. I bolted back up the stairs, taking them two at a time. The buzzing followed me, growing louder with each step. When I reached my floor, I threw myself through the door and into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. The light above my apartment door flickered violently, casting twisted, looping shadows on the walls. I had always been fascinated by museums, and when I saw the opening for a night security guard at the prestigious Morrow Museum, I jumped at the chance. The position promised a quiet, uneventful shift, allowing me to immerse myself in the displays while ensuring everything was secure. A perfect job for a recent college graduate like me, who wasn't quite ready to dive into the chaos of the outside world. Little did I know that my new role would soon thrust me into a waking nightmare, one that would test my sanity and survival. Morrow Museum was housed in a sprawling old building, its brick exterior draped in ivy and its windows so high they seemed to touch the sky. It was a place steeped in history, with artifacts from distant lands, ancient civilizations, and collections that spanned centuries. The walls themselves seemed to whisper stories of the past, but there was something about the museum, something I couldn't quite place, a chill in the air, a sense of unease that settled in my chest every time I walked through the grand lobby. The first few nights were calm. I'd make my rounds through the cavernous halls, checking locks, ensuring the alarm systems were armed, and monitoring the security cameras. The museum was beautiful, especially at night when the exhibits were shrouded in shadows, their secrets hidden from view, but it was also eerily quiet. So quiet that the sound of my footsteps echoed like a drumbeat against the marble floors. On my third night, things started to get strange. I was making my rounds, walking past the ancient Egypt exhibit, when I thought I saw something moving in the corner of my eye. I paused, my heart skipping a beat, and turned to face the display. The room was empty, its walls lined with centuries-old artifacts, statues of pharaohs, mummies encased in glass, and hieroglyphics etched into stone. Yet something felt off. The air felt heavier, as if it was pressing down on me. I shook it off as a trick of the mind and continued my patrol. But as I walked down the long hallway that led to the European art wing, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. There, at the far end of the corridor, was a figure, a shadow. At first, I thought it was another guard, or perhaps a late visitor who had snuck in unnoticed, though I knew that wasn't possible. The museum had been closed for hours. The figure stood motionless, its back to me, bathed in the dim light from an overhead lamp. I called out, my voice cutting through the silence. "Hello." The figure didn't move. It didn't respond. I stepped forward cautiously, my pulse quickening, unsure if I should approach or retreat. But something told me to move closer. As I took another step, the figure slowly turned to face me. I froze. It was a man, tall, thin, with sharp, angular features. His skin was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes, I couldn't see them clearly, not in the dim light. But there was something unsettling about them, something empty. His face was gaunt, drawn as if he hadn't eaten or slept in weeks. And yet, despite his skeletal appearance, there was an unsettling stillness to him, as though he were more statue than man. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling despite myself. "You're not supposed to be here." The man didn't respond. He simply stared at me, his eyes unblinking. A sense of dread washed over me, and I instinctively reached for the radio on my belt. But before I could even touch it, the man turned sharply and walked toward one of the nearby displays, a massive, ornate mirror from the 18th century. Without a sound, he seemed to disappear into the shadows, his figure melding with the darkness as if he had never been there. I stood frozen, staring at the spot where he had vanished, my mind racing. Had I imagined it? I couldn't have. I had seen him, I was sure of it. I rushed to the display where he had been standing, but there was nothing. No sign of him. No trace. Just the quiet hum of the museum at night. Shaken, I continued my rounds, the strange encounter weighing heavily on my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was watching me from the darkened corners of the museum. But the rest of the night passed without incident. The next few nights were more of the same quiet, uneventful, and yet, I couldn't escape the nagging sensation that I wasn't alone. Every time I turned a corner, I felt eyes on me, and I swore I could hear faint whispers in the distance. The sounds were always soft, indistinct, as though coming from the farthest reaches of the building, but they unsettled me. I would check the cameras, but they always showed the same thing: empty hallways, silent displays. Then, on my 5th night, something changed. I was in the main atrium, the largest room in the museum, when I saw him again. The man. This time he was standing at the base of the grand staircase that led to the upper floors. His back was to me, and for a moment I considered calling the police. But something stopped me. He hadn't done anything wrong yet. I couldn't explain it, but I felt compelled to approach him. "Hey," I called out, trying to sound confident. "You need to leave." The man turned slowly, his gaze locking with mine. For a split second, I thought I saw something change in his eyes, something darker, more predatory. His lips curled into a faint smile, and then, without a word, he began to walk toward me. I instinctively backed away, my heart racing in my chest. His movements were unnaturally smooth, too fluid, like a marionette being controlled by invisible strings. He didn't make a sound as he moved, not a single footstep echoing against the marble floor. "Stay back," I shouted, reaching for my radio again. But it wasn't there. The radio was gone. I whipped around in panic, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The entire atrium was dark now, the lights having flickered out without warning. I was plunged into near total darkness, and the man's silhouette was the only thing I could make out. He was closer now, too close. In a blind panic, I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the floor as I sped through the hallways. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away from him. I could hear his footsteps behind me now, soft and measured, but always too close. His presence seemed to fill the space around me, pressing down on me with an intensity I couldn't explain. I darted into the Egyptian exhibit, hoping to lose him in the labyrinth of statues and displays. But as I turned a corner, I found myself face to face with him once more. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, his eyes fixed on mine, his expression cold and unfeeling. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I felt paralyzed. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the loud screech of a door opening behind me. I didn't hesitate. I turned and ran, bursting through the door into the security office. I slammed it shut behind me, my hand shaking as I fumbled for the phone. But when I looked up, the man was there. He was standing on the other side of the glass, staring at me, his face pressed up against the window. I don't know how I managed it, but I somehow made it through the rest of the night. When the morning shift arrived, I bolted from the museum, my heart still racing in my chest. I haven't gone back since. I've heard rumors about the museum, about a previous night guard who disappeared without a trace. No one knows what happened to him, but I know. The silent stalker is still there, waiting. And he's watching me. I never thought I'd move back to my childhood home. After everything that had happened, I thought it was better to leave it all behind. But when my husband, Eric, and I were looking for a new place, we stumbled across an old listing for the house in our hometown. It was being sold for nearly half of its market value, and something about it drew me in. Maybe it was nostalgia. Maybe it was just the appeal of an old house full of memories. Whatever the reason, we decided to take the plunge. We drove to the house on a cool autumn afternoon, my heart beating faster with every mile. The town hadn't changed much since I left. The same old shops, the same small town charm. The house, however, looked different. It stood at the end of a long, overgrown driveway, a once grand structure now worn and faded. But it was still beautiful, in a way, its large windows staring out over the land like eyes that had seen too much. Eric and I toured the place, and despite its age, it had a certain charm. The hardwood floors, the old fireplace, the sprawling backyard, it all felt like home. I couldn't explain it, but there was a comfort in the air, a familiarity that settled into my bones. We made an offer, and before long the house was ours. The first few days were filled with the usual chaos of moving in, boxes piled high, furniture being rearranged, and the sound of hammering as we made a few repairs. But as we settled in, something started to feel off. Small things, at first. A light flickering in the hallway, the sound of footsteps in the attic when no one was up there, and an overwhelming sense of being watched. I chalked it up to the house settling, the creaks and groans of an old building. But as the days wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One night, after we had finally gotten everything in place, I was in the kitchen making dinner when I heard it soft, almost inaudible, like a whisper. "Mama?" I froze, my hand stilling on the countertop. For a split second, I thought I had imagined it. I turned around, expecting to see my daughter Lily standing behind me, but the kitchen was empty. My breath caught in my throat. Lily had been asleep in her room, and Eric was upstairs in the study. I shook my head and forced myself to focus. It was probably just the house settling again. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. "Mama?" The voice was high-pitched and sweet, but there was something wrong about it. A chill crawled up my spine. I turned toward the doorway leading to the hallway, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a figure standing in the shadows. My heart raced, and I quickly stepped toward the door, but when I opened it, no one was there. Lily's room was at the end of the hall, and when I walked in, she was sound asleep, her small body curled under the covers. I stood there for a moment, watching her, trying to calm my racing heart. It was just my imagination. I was exhausted from the move, and the stress was getting to me. But as I turned to leave the room, I heard it again. This time it was a soft giggle, followed by the unmistakable sound of tiny footsteps padding across the floor. I spun around, but the room was still empty. Lily was still asleep, her breathing steady and calm. I hurried out of the room, my pulse pounding in my ears. As I passed the hallway mirror, I caught a glimpse of something I couldn't quite make out. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I swore I saw a figure standing just behind me in the reflection, a childlike shape with pale skin and dark, hollow eyes. But when I spun around, the hallway was empty. I didn't sleep that night. The next day I tried to brush it off. It had been a long day and I was just overtired. But the house seemed to be full of strange sounds now, whispers in the dark, footsteps following me when no one was there, and the faint sound of a child's laughter echoing through the walls. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me. Then, one evening after Lily had gone to bed, I was sitting in the living room reading when I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a soft, high-pitched voice, just like before. "Mommy, come play with me!" I stood up so fast that the chair toppled over. I turned to see a small figure standing in the doorway, her back to me. She was a little girl, no older than Lily, wearing an old-fashioned white dress with lace trim. Her hair hung down in limp, dark strands, and she didn't move. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. But the figure didn't respond. It just stood there, motionless, as if it were waiting for something. I took a step forward, my heart pounding in my chest. "What do you want?" The figure slowly turned around and I gasped. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes dark and hollow. Her lips twisted into a thin, mocking smile, and I felt a cold chill seep into my bones. "You shouldn't have come back," the girl whispered. "She's waiting for you." I stumbled backward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I had to get out of the house. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew it wasn't safe. I turned to run, but when I looked back, the girl was gone. I didn't sleep that night, and I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. But I had to keep going. I had to protect Lily. I decided to look into the house's history, to find out if there was anything that could explain what was happening. What I found shocked me. The house had been built over a century ago, but its history was clouded in mystery. The previous owners had lived there for decades, a young couple with a daughter who had tragically drowned in the press shelf. The little girl, her name was Emily, had been just 5 years old when she died. Her parents, devastated by the loss, had never been able to leave the house. The grief had consumed them, and they had lived in isolation, locked in the house with their sorrow. They were never seen again. The house had been abandoned for years after that, but no one had dared to live there. The chilling part of the story was that Emily's body had never been found. I couldn't believe it. Emily's spirit, or whatever was left of her, was still here, still haunting the house, and somehow she had attached herself to Lily. That night I went to Lily's room, determined to confront whatever was in the house. I stood at the foot of her bed, watching her sleep, my heart heavy with fear. I didn't know how to stop this, how to rid the house of the presence that had taken over it. But I knew one thing for sure: I had to protect my daughter. Suddenly I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The air grew colder, the room darker, and I could hear the soft sound of a child's laughter echoing through the walls. My breath caught in my throat. "Leave us alone," I shouted into the empty room. "She's my daughter. You can't have her." The laughter stopped, and for a brief moment there was silence. Then, in a voice that sent a shiver down my spine, I heard the girl's voice once more. "She belongs with me." The temperature in the room dropped even further, and I felt a presence, cold and oppressive, standing just behind me. I turned to see Emily's face, pale and twisted with sorrow, staring back at me. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I reached out, my hand trembling, and spoke the words I had found in the research. I wasn't sure if it would work, but I had to try. "Emily, you're not alone. Your parents loved you, but you need to let go. You can't keep haunting us." For a moment, nothing happened. The room stayed still, and I held my breath, waiting. Then, slowly, the air warmed, and the oppressive presence lifted. The laughter faded, and I heard the faintest whisper, a soft voice carried on the wind. "Thank you." The room was quiet. Lily slept on, unaware of the battle that had just taken place. The house felt different now, lighter somehow. The darkness that had clung to the walls seemed to have lifted, and for the first time since we moved in, I felt a sense of peace. Emily had found her way, and I had saved my daughter from the past. But the strange part, as I stood there, looking at my little girl, I could have sworn I saw a fleeting shadow in the corner of the room, a shadow that disappeared as quickly as it had come. Some stories don't end. Some children never truly leave. It was supposed to be my fresh start. After the divorce and losing my job, I wanted to disappear for a while to find peace somewhere far away from people and problems. That's how I ended up renting an old, secluded cabin on Hollow Hill. The ad promised tranquility and breathtaking views, and the photos showed a quaint little place surrounded by thick woods. It looked like the perfect escape. When I arrived, the cabin was just as charming as I had hoped, small but cozy. with a stone fireplace and large windows that overlooked the dense forest. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the only sound was the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. It was perfect, or so I thought. The first night was uneventful. I unpacked my things, lit a fire in the hearth, and settled into the worn leather armchair with a book. The silence was almost too perfect, and for the first time in years, I felt at ease. As the hours ticked by, I eventually drifted off to sleep. But then, in the early hours of the morning, I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind. A faint, low whistling, almost musical. But as I listened closer, I realized it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from above. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The cabin didn't have an upstairs, just a single floor with a small attic I hadn't even thought to check. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon or a squirrel that had found its way into the crawl space. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. The next morning, I grabbed a flashlight and a ladder and climbed up to the attic. It was empty, just dusty beams and cobwebs. No sign of animals, no droppings, no nests. I breathed a sigh of relief, convincing myself that I had imagined the noise. I went about my day, exploring the nearby trails and taking in the beauty of the woods. That night, the sound came back. It started as a faint creaking, as if someone or something was shifting their weight in the attic. Then, the whistling began again. This time it was clearer, more distinct, like a tune being hummed by someone just out of sight. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear, listening to the sound. My rational mind told me it was nothing, that the old cabin was just settling, or that the wind was playing tricks on me. But deep down I knew better. There was something up there. The following day, I called the owner of the cabin, an older man named Mr. Grayson. He sounded surprised when I mentioned the noises. "No one's been up there for years," he said. "It's probably just the wood creaking or some critters. These old cabins have their quirks, you know." I wasn't convinced, but what could I do? I decided to ignore it and hoped it would go away. It didn't. Over the next few nights, the sounds grew louder and more persistent. Footsteps pacing back and forth, soft whispers just on the edge of hearing, and the whistling, always the whistling. It was a haunting, mournful melody that sent chills down my spine, and then came the knocking. It started softly, a rhythmic tapping that echoed through the cabin. First on the ceiling, then the walls, then the front door. When I mustered the courage to check, there was never anyone there. One night I woke to the sound of something dragging across the floor above me. It was slow, deliberate, and heavy. My heart raced as I stared at the ceiling, clutching the flashlight I kept by my bed. The sound stopped suddenly, and the silence was deafening. Then, a single word drifted down from the attic, spoken in a voice that was soft yet chilling. "Leave." That was it. I was done. I packed my bag and decided to leave the cabin that morning. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were footprints in the dirt leading from the edge of the woods to the front door. Small, bare footprints. And they weren't mine. I looked around, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement, but the woods were still, too still. No birds, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive, unnatural silence. I hurried back inside, bolting the door behind me. That night I barricaded myself in the bedroom, every light in the cabin blazing. I didn't sleep. Around midnight, the noises started again. This time they were louder, angrier. The footsteps in the attic turned into stomping, the whispers into wails, and the knocking into pounding. I cowered in the corner of the room, clutching a knife, my eyes glued to the door. And then I heard it. A child's voice, clear and soft, speaking just outside the bedroom door. "Why won't you play with me?" I screamed, and the pounding stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. I didn't dare move until the first light of dawn seeped through the windows. Gathering my courage, I opened the bedroom door, prepared to make a run for my car, but what I saw stopped me in my tracks. The floor of the living room was covered in muddy footprints. Small, childlike footprints that led from the front door to the fireplace, then back to the attic hatch. The door to the attic was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness peering down at me like an unblinking eye. I fled. Nah. I didn't stop running until I reached the car, fumbling with the keys as tears streamed down my face. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and felt my stomach drop. Standing in the window of the cabin was a child. A girl in a white dress, her face pale and expressionless, watching me as I disappeared down the dirt road. I never went back to that cabin. When I called Mr. Grayson to tell him what had happened, he was silent for a long time before finally speaking. "You're not the first," he said quietly. "The cabin. It's been there a long time, longer than it should have been. And the woods. They don't like it when people stay too long. I don't know what I encountered on Hollow Hill, but I know one thing for certain: something lives there, something that doesn't want to be disturbed. If you ever find yourself in those woods, don't stay past dark. And if you hear the whistling, run.